The wind screamed through the mountain pass like a creature in agony, carrying with it the merciless bite of winter that never truly released these northern peaks. Snow fell in thick, swirling curtains, transforming the world into a blur of white and shadow. The pine forest stood sentinel in the storm, ancient trees groaning under the weight of ice that had accumulated over centuries of harsh seasons. Through this frozen hellscape, a lone figure moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned that a single misstep could mean death. Era Blackwood pulled her threadbare cloak tighter around her shoulders, the fabric doing almost nothing to protect her from the cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. Her breath emerged in small clouds that were immediately torn away by the wind. She had made this journey countless times over the past 3 years, ever since her 18th birthday, when her true nature as an Omega had manifested and revealed the cruel truth that would define every moment of her existence. She had no scent. In a world where werewolves identified everything through the complex language of pheromones and biological markers, where pack bonds were built on the intricate web of scents that tied wolf to wolf, she was essentially invisible, a ghost among her own kind. And the Shadow Moon Pack had wasted no time making clear exactly how much of a burden that made her. The path to the forbidden clearing was overgrown and treacherous, deliberately neglected by the pack members who feared the curse that lingered in that sacred space. Branches heavy with snow reached out like grasping fingers, and more than once, Era had to duck beneath low-hanging limbs or navigate around ice-slicked roots that threatened to send her tumbling down the mountainside. But she knew this route better than anyone. She had mapped every twist and turn in the privacy of her tiny shack, had memorized the placement of every landmark, every safe handhold, every dangerous patch of loose stone. It was one of her secrets, one of the few things she had that truly belonged to her. The pack had taken everything else. Above her, the sky was a turbulent mass of dark clouds moving rapidly from the northwest. Era paused, tilting her head back to study their formation. The way they layered the particular shade of gray-black at their leading edge, the speed of their movement across the sky, all of it spoke to her in a language she had taught herself over years of careful observation. Another storm was coming, a big one. Within 2 hours, maybe 3, the temperature would drop another 15 degrees and the snowfall would intensify to the point where even the strongest wolves would struggle to navigate the mountain passes. Not that anyone would listen to her if she warned them. 3 years ago, when she had first noticed the patterns, she had tried to share her observations with the pack. She had warned them of an incoming blizzard, had explained the signs she had seen in the clouds, and the behavior of the forest animals. The pack's weather tracker, a grizzled beta named Corvain Ashford, had laughed in her face and told her that a scentless Omega had no business pretending to understand things meant for real wolves. The blizzard had struck exactly when Era predicted. 3 wolves had been caught outside the territory and had barely made it back alive. Corvain had taken credit for the warning, claiming he had been about to sound the alert when the storm hit. No one had questioned him. No one had even looked at Era. That was when she learned to keep her knowledge to herself, to hoard her observations like precious gems that might one day buy her freedom. She pushed through the final curtain of frost-covered branches and stepped into the clearing, and there he was, exactly as he had been yesterday and the day before and every single day since 1724. The frozen wolf stood in the center of the clearing, impossibly massive even by Alpha standards. He was easily 15 feet tall at the shoulder, his body caught in mid-stride, as though he had been running when the curse struck. One enormous paw was raised, frozen in the act of taking another step. His head was turned slightly, looking back over his shoulder at something only he could see, something lost to time and legend. His fur was pure white, so brilliant it seemed to generate its own light, even in the dim gray of the storm-darkened forest. Every individual hair was perfectly preserved in crystalline ice, each one visible and distinct, creating a texture that was both beautiful and terrible to behold. But it was his eyes that always caught Era's attention, that had captivated her from the very first moment she stumbled into this clearing 3 years ago. They were amber-colored, vibrant, and alive despite the ice that encased them. Sometimes when the light hit them just right, Era could swear she saw awareness in those frozen depths. Intelligence, consciousness. As though something inside the statue was still awake, still aware, still experiencing every moment of its eternal imprisonment. The legend said his name was Kieran Frost, and that he had been the cruelest Alpha King the Northern Territories had ever known. The stories whispered through the pack painted him as a tyrant who had crushed smaller packs beneath his rule, who had treated Omegas as disposable breeding stock, who had valued power above all else, including the sacred bonds that the moon goddess herself had ordained. They said a powerful witch had frozen him in eternal awareness, trapped forever in a prison of ice and consciousness, unable to move or speak or die, only to exist in silent suffering as penance for sins so terrible that even death was too merciful a punishment. The clearing where he stood had become a place of dark legend. Parents threatened to abandon disobedient children here. Even the bravest warriors refused to tread on this ground. The pack elders had declared it forbidden territory, a warning to all wolves of what happened when an alpha allowed cruelty to corrupt their strength. But Ara had never been brave in the traditional sense. She had never had the luxury of fearing legends when her daily reality was frightening enough. She settled onto her usual spot on a flat rock near the frozen wolf's massive front paws, the stone cold even through her worn skirts. She arranged her clothing as best she could to conserve what little warmth her body generated, then pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a piece of bread no bigger than her palm and a chunk of cheese that had seen better days. It was all she had managed to save from her meager rations this week. The pack had stopped providing for her properly 6 months ago, the leadership deciding it was a waste of resources to feed an Omega who could never fulfill an Omega's purpose. Without a cent, no Alpha would ever claim her. No bond could ever form. Which meant she was useless for the alliances and political connections that Omega pairings provided. She had been moved from the communal Omega house to a tiny shack on the outskirts of the territory, given the most menial and backbreaking tasks, and told in no uncertain terms that her continued existence was an act of charity that could be revoked at any moment. The pack had a budget of $850 per month for supplies and rations. Iara knew this because she had seen the ledgers when she had been forced to clean the pack house. She had memorized the numbers, had done the calculations in her head during the long, lonely nights in her shack. They gave her the equivalent of $40 worth of food per month. Barely enough to survive on, just enough to keep her alive to perform the endless list of degrading tasks they assigned her. Iara took a small bite of the bread and began to speak, her voice soft in the winter silence, barely audible over the wind that continued to howl through the trees. "The vote is tomorrow," she said, addressing the frozen statue as she had done for 3 years now. "I overheard Alpha Grayson talking to the council last night. They're going to decide if I should be banished from the pack entirely." She paused, chewing slowly to make the bread last longer. The frozen wolf's amber eyes seemed to stare at her with an intensity that sometimes made her uncomfortable, but she had long since grown used to it. "Thaddeus Grayson," she continued, using the Alpha's full name. "He's been looking for an excuse to get rid of me for months now. He says I cost the pack $480 per year in resources and produce nothing of value in return." A bitter laugh escaped her lips, the sound harsh and broken. "As if I haven't been scrubbing floors and mending clothes and gathering firewood and doing every other task they can think of. As if my labor means nothing because I don't have a cent." She told the frozen wolf about her day, about how the head Omega, a cruel woman named Isolde, had screamed at her for 2 hours because she had folded the linens in the wrong order. About how she had been forced to scrub 200 square feet of stone floor with nothing but a small rag, her knees aching and her hands raw by the time she finished. She talked about Corvain Ashford the Beta, who took particular pleasure in tormenting her. Just last week, he had gathered a group of younger wolves and they had thrown stones at her shack throughout the night, howling insults about defective Omegas and genetic mistakes while she huddled inside, too afraid to emerge and face them. "I tried to warn them about the storm coming," Era said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw the cloud formations this morning. Northwest pattern, moving fast, temperature inversion in the upper atmosphere. We'll have a major blizzard within 3 hours. But I didn't say anything. Why would I? They never listen. They never believe me." She took another small bite of cheese, making it last, and continued her one-sided conversation. "Sometimes I think about leaving," she admitted, staring at the frozen wolf's face. "Just walking away from the pack and never looking back. But I know what happens to unmated Omegas out there. We have no rights in werewolf society. I would be considered rogue fair game for any Alpha who wanted to claim me or hurt me with no pack to demand justice or retribution." The wind picked up and Ara shivered violently. She pulled her cloak tighter, knowing it would do little good. "At least here, as miserable as I am, I have the nominal protection of pack bonds. Even if those bonds feel more like chains than safety. Even if no one would actually defend me if something happened." She finished her meager meal and sat in silence for a moment, studying the frozen wolf. The ice that encased him was incredibly clear, like crystal, allowing her to see every detail of his massive form. She could make out individual muscles beneath the fur, could see the texture of his paw pads, could trace the lines of old scars that had been preserved along with everything else. "I wonder what you did," she said softly, "to deserve this. The legends say you were aware for all these years. conscious of every moment but unable to move or speak or change anything. That's, that's crueler than death. That's torture that never ends. She reached out slowly, carefully, and placed her palm against the ice near his massive paw. It was cold, of course, so cold it almost burned to touch. But there was something else there too, something she could never quite name. A sensation that felt almost like warmth beneath the ice, as though somewhere deep inside the frozen prison, something still lived. The legends say you were terrible. Ara continued, her hand still resting on the ice. That you crushed other packs, that you treated Omegas like objects, that you cared only for power and control. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if legends ever tell the whole truth, but I know what it feels like to be powerless. I know what it's like when stronger wolves decide your life has no value. She pulled her hand back, flexing her fingers to restore circulation. If you were really that cruel, maybe you deserve this punishment. Maybe all these years aren't long enough for the pain you caused, but I can't help feeling, I don't know, sorry for you. Is that stupid? To feel sorry for someone who might have been a monster? What Ara could not know, what no one in the pack could possibly know, was that inside his prison of ice, Kieran Frost heard every single word. He had been aware since 1724, trapped in a hell of his own making, forced to experience every second of 109,500 days, with nothing but his thoughts and regrets for company. Time moved strangely when you could not sleep or move or even blink. Days blurred into years, years into decades, until he had long since lost any real sense of how long he had been frozen. The witch's curse had been specific and cruel. He would remain aware of everything, would feel the cold eternally, without the mercy of numbness, would remember every terrible thing he had done with perfect clarity. And he would stay this way until someone with a pure heart freely chose to forgive the unforgivable. For the first century, Kieran had raged inside his frozen prison. He had cursed the witch, cursed fate, cursed the moon goddess herself for allowing this to happen to him. He had refused to accept that he deserved this punishment, had convinced himself that he had simply been doing what alphas were supposed to do, taking power and holding it through strength and fear. So what if he had been cruel? The world was cruel. So what if he had treated Omegas as objects? That was what they were for, to serve alphas and bear strong pups. He had rejected his true mate, a woman named Elena Thornwood, who had been nothing more than a healer's daughter, with no political connections, choosing instead to take the daughter of a rival pack alpha as his chosen mate to cement an alliance. When Elena had confronted him, begging him to reconsider, pleading with him to honor the bond the moon goddess had created, he had laughed in her face. He had told her she should be grateful he did not simply take her as a concubine, since that was all a lowborn Omega was worth. He had not known she was a witch, had not known her bloodline carried ancient magic that most werewolves had forgotten existed. She had placed her hand over his heart and spoken words in a language that predated the packs themselves, a tongue that thrummed with power that made his wolf whimper in recognition and terror. The ice had spread from that point of contact, crawling across his skin like living crystal, encasing him completely within seconds. She had told him he would remain frozen until he understood the value of a heart he had treated as disposable, until someone pure of spirit chose to care for the monster he had become. Then she had disappeared, walking away from the clearing without looking back, leaving him to his eternal sentence. The second century had been worse than the first. The rage had eventually burned itself out, leaving behind only the crushing weight of his crimes. Without the ability to distract himself, without the option of denial, Kieran had been forced to confront what he had done with the crystal clarity that only absolute stillness could provide. He remembered every Omega he had abused, every wolf he had killed to secure his power, every act of casual cruelty he had committed without a second thought. He remembered their faces, their voices, the way they had looked at him with fear and hatred, and worst of all, resignation. He remembered Elena's face, the hope dying in her eyes as he rejected her, the way she had trembled as she cursed him, not with anger, but with a sadness so profound it had shaken something in him even then. The knowledge that he had broken something precious and irreplaceable because it was not politically convenient. By the third century, Kieran had moved beyond rage and regret into something approaching acceptance. He deserved this. Every frozen moment was justice for the pain he had caused. He stopped hoping for release and started hoping only that his suffering might somehow balance the scales of the hurt he had inflicted. The forest had grown quiet around him over the decades. The packs that had once warred over this territory had forgotten him or turned him into legend. Occasionally someone would stumble into the clearing, but they never stayed long, sensing the dark history that clung to the space like morning fog. Then 3 years ago, everything had changed. A young woman had entered the clearing, moving with the careful grace of someone used to making herself small and unthreatening. She had stared at him for a long moment, and even through the ice, even without the ability to scent her properly, Kieran had known what she was. Omega. Everything about her posture and presence screamed it. The way she held herself, the natural submission in her bearing, that she could not hide no matter how hard she tried. But there was something wrong, something missing. He could not smell her at all. At first, Kieran had not understood why she kept coming back. Day after day, season after season, she returned to speak to him, sharing her pain and her small joys with someone who could not respond. But slowly, agonizingly slowly, he began to understand. She was like him in a way, trapped, rejected, deemed defective by those who should have valued her. The difference was that she had done nothing to deserve her suffering while he had earned every moment of his. And yet she bore her pain with a grace and goodness that humbled him more than all his years of isolation had managed. Listening to Ara over the years had changed something fundamental in Kieran. She helped elderly pack members, even though they treated her with contempt. She rescued injured animals and nursed them back to health in her tiny shack. She shared her meager food with hungry pups whose parents had forbidden them from accepting anything from the defective Omega. She was everything he had never been. Kind, generous, genuinely good, despite having every reason to become as bitter and cruel as the wolves who tormented her. She made him want to be better, made him wish desperately that he could go back and undo every terrible choice he had made. Something else had begun happening about 6 months ago. Something that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. When Ara spoke to him, when she sat close enough that her warmth seeped through the ice, Kieran felt something crack inside him. Not the ice itself, but something deeper. The magical bindings that held him frozen. It was imperceptible at first, the tiniest loosening of the curse's grip. But it grew stronger each time she visited. Each time she showed him compassion he had never earned and did not deserve. He did not understand why or how, but somehow her presence was weakening the witch's spell. Today, as she told him about the upcoming vote about the pack's plan to banish her, Kieran felt the cracking sensation grow stronger than it had ever been. Ara's voice wavered as she spoke, and he realized with shock that she was crying. In 3 years, he had never heard her cry, not even when describing the worst abuses she suffered. She had always maintained a careful composure, as if allowing herself to fully feel would break something essential inside her. But today something had clearly pushed her past her limits. Her tears fell onto the ice near his paw, each drop seeming to sizzle slightly. On contact, the moisture evaporating in tiny wisps of steam, despite the freezing temperature. Ara was sobbing now, her words coming out in broken gasps. "I don't know what I'll do," she choked out. "If they banish me, I'll die out here. Winter is coming. I have no survival skills beyond what I've learned gathering firewood. I can't hunt. I can't fight. I'm just an Omega who can't even do the one thing Omegas are supposed to do." She pressed her forehead against the ice, her whole body shaking with the force of her tears. "I'm so tired," she whispered. "I'm so tired of being invisible, of being discarded, of waking up every day knowing that no one would care if I just disappeared, that maybe they would even celebrate." Her pain hit Kieran like a physical blow. Centuries of forced stillness and hard-won acceptance shattered in that moment. Rage flooded through him. Not the selfish fury of his first century of imprisonment, but righteous anger at the injustice of Ara's suffering. She deserved protection and safety and love. She deserved to be valued and cherished and treated with the respect that every living being was owed. And instead, the world was going to let her die alone in the wilderness because of something that was not even her fault. The emotion was so powerful, so all-consuming, that Kieran did not immediately notice that something was different. But then he felt it. Genuine physical sensation for the first time since Elena's curse struck. Movement. His eye twitched. Actually moved in its socket, shifting fractionally to the right. The shock of it was so overwhelming that if he had been able to gasp, he would have. After 109,500 days of absolute stillness, even that tiny motion felt like an earthquake. He focused every ounce of will he possessed on that tiny spark of freedom, pushing against the curse with everything he had. His other eye moved, his vision shifting slightly, bringing Ara's tear-stained face into sharper focus. The curse was breaking. After all this time, the magical bindings were finally loosening their grip, and it was happening because of her. Because of this Omega who had shown compassion to someone who had not deserved it. Because she had chosen day after day to treat him like something worth talking to, instead of the tyrant he had been. Kieran pushed harder, drawing on reserves of strength he had not accessed in centuries. The ice around his jaw creaked, hairline fractures spreading through the crystal. With a sound like breaking glass, his jaw unlocked just enough for him to force air through his throat. The sound that emerged was barely recognizable as speech, a rough and broken approximation of a word that he had not spoken since 1724. It came out as a rasping growl that was more wolf than human, his vocal cords damaged from centuries of disuse. But it was unmistakably a word. Stay. Ara jerked back from the frozen statue, her eyes wide with terror. For a moment, she was utterly frozen herself, convinced she had imagined it, that grief and exhaustion had finally driven her mad. But then the wolf's eyes moved. Actually moved. Those amber eyes that she had told herself were lifeless now tracked her as she scrambled backwards, following her motion with unmistakable awareness and something that looked almost like desperate pleading. She should have run. Every instinct screamed at her to flee from the awakening creature, to put as much distance as possible between herself and whatever terrible thing was happening in this cursed clearing. But 3 years of one-sided friendship held her in place. This creature, curse or not, had been her only companion, her only comfort. The only being in the world who had never hurt her, never judged her, never made her feel like a burden. And now it was looking at her like she was the only thing anchoring it to sanity. Slowly, carefully, Ara moved closer again, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the ice near his muzzle. The ice was warm under her fingertips. Impossibly warm, as if something inside was generating heat, fighting against the curse that had held it prisoner for so long. Spiderweb cracks were spreading from where her tears had fallen, growing larger with each passing second. What's happening? Ara whispered, her voice shaking. What's happening to you? Before either of them could process what was occurring, the forest erupted with noise. Howls echoed through the trees, dozens of them coming from multiple directions, the sound carrying clearly despite the wind. Ara's blood ran cold as she recognized the cadence, the particular rhythm that marked these calls as coming from organized packs rather than random rogues. But they were not the howls of Shadow Moon wolves. She knew those voices, knew the pattern they used when coordinating hunts or warning of danger. These were different, unfamiliar, and they were coming from at least 2 separate directions converging on the clearing. Ara stumbled to her feet, her heart hammering in her chest as the first wolves burst through the tree line. Her breath caught in her throat. These were not ordinary pack wolves. They wore strange markings painted on their fur in what looked like blood symbols she did not recognize, but that radiated malevolence. Their eyes glowed with a fanatical fervor that spoke of madness or religious obsession. Within seconds, more than a dozen of these marked wolves surrounded the clearing, cutting off any escape route. They moved with military precision, clearly experienced in coordinated attacks. A massive gray wolf stepped forward, larger than any beta, but not quite reaching alpha size. He shifted mid-stride into a tall man covered in scars and ritual tattoos that matched the blood marks on the wolf's fur. His hair was long and matted, his beard unkempt, and his eyes held the kind of zealous intensity that made Ara's skin crawl. His voice was rough with age and madness when he spoke, addressing the frozen statue as though it were a deity. "The frozen king awakens," he said, and there was reverence in his tone that bordered on worship. "We have kept the faith. We have watched for the signs. And now the prophecy comes to pass." He turned his gaze to Ara, and the contempt in his expression made her flinch. "And we have you to thank, little Omega," he continued. "Your tears of pure despair, untainted by any alpha's claim, have begun to break the curse. Our seers told us to watch for this moment, to be ready when the ice finally started to crack." Ara backed toward the frozen wolf, her mind racing. These wolves worshipped Kirin, or rather, they worshipped the tyrant he had been. They wanted to free him so he could return to his reign of terror, restore the brutal hierarchy where Omegas were property and strength was the only law. She looked at the partially awakened alpha behind her, seeing the awareness in his eyes but unable to read what that awareness meant. Was he the monster these cultists believed in? Would he join them the moment he was free, repaying her kindness by enslaving her? The scarred leader smiled, revealing teeth that had been filed to points in some grotesque ritual modification. "Do not look so frightened, Omega," he said, his tone mockingly gentle. "You have served your purpose admirably. When the Frozen King is fully awakened, you will have the honor of being his first conquest, his first demonstration that the natural order is restored. Alphas take what they want, and Omegas submit. That is the law of the moon, the law that weak packs have forgotten." More howls split the air, but these were different, familiar. Ara's heart sank even further as she recognized the voices of Shadow Moon wolves. Of course they had followed her. An Omega who could break ancient curses was far too valuable to simply let go. Alpha Thaddeus Grayson emerged from the opposite side of the clearing, with a dozen of his strongest warriors flanking him. He was a large man even in human form, with the kind of build that spoke of a lifetime of violence. His eyes cold and calculating, locked onto Ara with greedy assessment. "So the rumors are true," he said, his voice carrying across the clearing. "The defective Omega has a use after all." He studied the frozen wolf, the cracks spreading across its surface, and his smile was predatory. "Ancient Omega bloodlines," Grayson continued almost to himself. "The kind that can break curses and work miracles. The kind we read about in the old texts but thought were extinct. And we were going to throw away such a valuable resource." He looked at the rogue cultist and his expression hardened. "Whatever you are planning, abandon it now," he commanded. "That Omega belongs to Shadow Moon Pack, as does any creature she awakens. You will leave our territory immediately or face the consequences." The cult leader laughed, a sound devoid of humor or sanity. "Your territory," he sneered. "You have no claim here, soft alpha. This is sacred ground, and the Frozen King belongs to those who never forgot the old ways. We will restore him to his rightful place, and weak packs like yours will kneel or be destroyed." The clearing erupted into chaos. Wolves from both groups clashed, tearing into each other with savage fury. The sound of snarls and screams filled the air, along with the metallic scent of blood that quickly began to stain the snow. Ara found herself trapped in the middle of a battlefield, caught between those who wanted to use her and those who wanted to use what she had awakened. She pressed herself against the frozen wolf's massive paw, feeling the ice continuing to crack and warm beneath her touch. The battle raged around her wolves, fighting and dying over ownership of her and the creature she had accidentally freed. A rogue cultist broke away from the main fight, his eyes locked on Ara with fanatical purpose. He lunged toward her, jaws open and ready to drag her away from the relative safety of the frozen statue. Ara screamed and pressed harder against the frozen alpha, and something inside her that had been dormant her entire life suddenly broke open. Power flooded out of her in waves. It was pure Omega energy, the kind she had never been able to access because there had never been an alpha she was meant to channel it to. But Kieran was different. Even Frozen even cursed something in him, called to something in her, and her power answered that call with desperate intensity. The golden light that erupted from her body was visible, even in the dim afternoon gloom, bright enough to make the fighting wolves pause and shield their eyes. The ice around Kieran exploded outward in a massive wave of steam and shattered crystal, the shockwave strong enough to knock several of the nearby wolves off their feet. For the first time since 1724, Kieran Frost drew a full breath. The sensation of breathing after centuries of stillness was agony and ecstasy in equal measure. Air rushed into lungs that had not expanded since the age of wooden ships and colonial settlements, filling them with a burning cold that felt like liquid fire. Every nerve ending in Kieran's body screamed, as blood that had been frozen began to flow again, as muscles that had been locked in crystalline stasis suddenly remembered how to move. He had forgotten what it felt like to feel. The pain was extraordinary, but beneath it was something even more powerful, the overwhelming joy of simply existing in a body that could respond to his commands. His massive wolf form trembled as he took another breath, then another, learning the rhythm all over again like a newborn pup. The golden light that had shattered his prison was fading now, but he could still feel its source. The Omega, Ara. Her power wrapped around him like a warm blanket, and through it he could sense her terror, her exhaustion, her desperate hope that she had not just unleashed something that would destroy her. Kieran's eyes, now fully mobile and no longer trapped in that eternal forward stare, found her immediately. She had collapsed against a tree at the edge of the clearing, her face pale and her breathing labored. The amount of power she had channeled to break his curse had clearly drained her to the point of collapse. Around them, the battle had frozen. Every wolf in the clearing, cultist and pack member alike, stared at him with a mixture of awe and terror. The Frozen King was free. The tyrant of legend had returned. Kieran could feel their expectations pressing down on him like a physical weight. The cultists expected him to embrace the creature he had been, to lead them in restoring the brutal hierarchy they worshipped. The Shadow Moon Wolves expected him to be a threat, something violent that needed to be controlled or destroyed. And Ara? What did she expect? He looked at her again and saw the fear in her eyes. But there was something else there too. A fragile thread of hope. She had spent 3 years speaking to him, sharing her pain and her small joys with a frozen statue. Some part of her wanted to believe that he could be more than the legend, more than the tyrant. He would not fail her. Not again. Not like he had failed Elena. The transformation from wolf to human form was instinctive muscle memory that had survived his imprisonment. The shift rippled through him, bones restructuring, muscles reforming, until he stood on two legs for the first time in longer than most of these wolves had been alive. He was nearly 7 feet tall, his body lean and corded with muscle despite the centuries of immobility. His hair had turned white during his imprisonment, falling past his shoulders in a cascade that matched his wolf form's coloring. His eyes remained that same vivid amber, burning with an intensity that made several of the watching wolves take an involuntary step backward. Old scars marked his skin, remnants of battles fought and won before his curse. He was naked as all shifters were after transformation, but there was nothing vulnerable about him. He radiated power that went beyond physical strength. This was the ancient magic of an alpha king, a creature from an age when werewolves were more spirit than flesh. The dominance that rolled off him in waves drove every wolf in the clearing to their knees. Alphas and betas and omegas alike found themselves forced down by the sheer weight of his authority, their wolves whimpering in submission to something so far above them on the hierarchy that resistance was impossible. Even Ira exhausted as she was felt the pull. But Kieran's power skipped over her like water flowing around a stone, refusing to force her submission. It was a conscious choice on his part, one that took effort to maintain. She had freed him. She deserved his protection, not his dominance. His voice when he spoke resonated with authority that could not be denied. It echoed across the clearing, carrying to every corner, despite the wind that still howled through the trees. Stop! The single word was a command that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to the wolf in each of them. The fighting ceased immediately, wolves frozen mid-attack by the weight of his power. Kieran looked first at the cultists, at their leader, with his scarred face and filed teeth and eyes full of fanatical devotion. What they saw in his gaze made several of them whimper. "You came here to resurrect a tyrant," Kieran said, his voice carrying the rasp of disuse but growing stronger with each word. "You worship a version of me that deserves no worship. You want to restore the old ways, to return to an age where strength justified cruelty and omegas were treated as property." He took a step forward, and the cult leader flinched despite himself. "That creature is dead," Kieran continued, and there was absolute certainty in his voice. "He was killed by centuries of consequence and the grace of one person who showed compassion to something that did not deserve it. I will not become him again. I will not lead you in restoring a system that was built on suffering and fear." The cult leader's face contorted with confusion and rage. "But you are the frozen king. You are the strongest alpha in 1,000 years. You crushed 12 packs beneath your rule. You understood that power is the only law that matters." "I was everything the legends say," Kieran said flatly. "I used strength to justify cruelty. I treated omegas as objects and kindness as weakness. And for those crimes, I spent centuries frozen in awareness, forced to confront every terrible thing I had done. That is a hell I would not wish on my worst enemy." He gestured to Era, still slumped against the tree, watching with wide eyes. "She came to me for 3 years. This omega who had been thrown away by her pack, who had every reason to become as bitter and cruel as those who tormented her. And instead she showed me compassion. She spoke to me as though I deserved kindness. She made me want to be better than I was." Kieran's eyes blazed as he looked at each cultist in turn. "If you cannot accept that the tyrant you worshipped is gone, then leave now. Find another cause to serve. But do not expect me to become the nightmare you want me to be." Several of the cultists began backing away, immediately unable to reconcile their beliefs with this reality. But others remained, and Kieran could see a different kind of hunger in their eyes now. These were wolves who had been lost, who had latched onto the cult because they needed something to believe in. They did not want a tyrant. They wanted a leader worth following. He would have to prove he could be that leader. But first he had to deal with the Shadow Moon Wolves. Kieran turned to face Alpha Thaddeus Grayson and his warriors, and the contempt in his expression was withering. "And you," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr, "you dare to claim ownership of her." He began walking toward Grayson, each step deliberate and controlled. The Shadow Moon Alpha tried to hold his ground, tried to meet Kieran's gaze with his own alpha dominance, but it was like a candle trying to outshine the sun. "This Omega who you threw away like garbage," Kieran continued, "who you starved and tormented and planned to execute. She owes you nothing. She is not a tool for you to use or a resource for you to exploit." Grayson's face flushed with anger and humiliation as he was forced to his knees by Kieran's power. Around him, his warriors were in similar positions, unable to rise, unable to even look up at the Alpha King who towered over them. "She is a person," Kieran said, and his voice carried across the clearing to every wolf present. "She deserves respect and safety and choice, and I will tear apart anyone who tries to take those things from her." He stopped directly in front of Grayson, looking down at the Alpha who had made Era's life a living hell. You will leave this clearing, you will return to your territory, and you will never come near her again. If I hear that you have harmed her or anyone under my protection, I will come for you. And centuries of reflection have not made me forget how to destroy those who prey on the vulnerable. It was a threat delivered with absolute calm, which made it all the more terrifying. Grayson could see in Kieran's eyes that this was not posturing or empty words. This was a promise. But Grayson had not become Pack Alpha by backing down from challenges. His pride would not allow him to retreat, especially not in front of his own wolves. She belongs to Shadow Moon Pack, Grayson growled, fighting against the dominance pressing down on him. You have no claim. He never finished the sentence. Kieran's hand shot out faster than the eye could follow, grasping Grayson by the throat and lifting him off his knees as though he weighed nothing. The Shadow Moon Alpha clawed at Kieran's wrist, trying to break free, but it was like trying to bend iron with bare hands. I have no claim, Kieran repeated softly, dangerously. You are right, I have no claim on her, because she is not property to be claimed. But she is my mate. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Kieran had felt it the moment the ice shattered, the moment his consciousness was fully restored, and he could sense the world around him without the filter of the curse. The bond that snapped into place between him and Era had been unmistakable, overwhelming in its intensity. True mates. Despite everything, despite the curse and the centuries and all the reasons it should have been impossible, fate had bound them together. The moon goddess, in her infinite wisdom or her cruel sense of irony, had given him a second chance at the very thing he had thrown away. The bond flooded Kieran with Era's emotions, now her shock, her confusion, her fear, and beneath it all, the fragile beginning of something that might become trust if he did not destroy it. And through that same bond, Era could feel him for the first time. Could sense his determination, his regret, his absolute conviction that he would protect her or die trying. The sensation was overwhelming for both of them. Ara had spent 21 years unable to sense any alpha, invisible to the very instincts that should have connected her to her kind. And now suddenly she was flooded with emotions and thoughts that were not her own, tethered to someone else in a way that was both terrifying and oddly comforting. For Kieran, the bond showed him something that made his blood run cold, even as it filled him with a fierce, protective rage. Ara was not defective. She had never been broken. She was the rarest kind of Omega, a pure blood whose abilities only manifested in the presence of her true mate. Her biology had been waiting for him, refusing to respond to anyone else, because at some fundamental level, she belonged with him and him alone. And she was powerful, far more powerful than anyone had realized. The magic that had broken his curse had come from her, from the combination of her tears and her compassion, and the Omega gifts that had been dormant all her life. The pack that had treated her as a burden had been abusing one of the most powerful Omegas born in centuries. The injustice of it made Kieran want to tear them all apart. But he was not that creature anymore. He would not let rage control him. He released Grayson, letting the Alpha drop back to his knees, gasping and clutching his throat. She is under my protection, Kieran said, his voice carrying to every wolf in the clearing. Any who wished to challenge that stepped forward now. No one moved. The cult leader, recovering from his shock, began to laugh. It was a manic, desperate sound that bordered on hysteria. You feel it, do not you, Frozen King, he called out. The bond, the power, take her, claim what is yours by right. Show us that the old day ways still have meaning. Kieran's eyes flashed dangerously as he turned to face the scarred cultist. The old ways were built on taking what we wanted without regard for consent or consequence. He said, his voice hard as stone. I will not honor them. I will not repeat the mistakes that earned me my punishment. He looked back at Ara, still slumped against the tree, watching him with eyes that held fear and hope in equal measure. I have no right to ask anything of you, Kieran said, addressing her directly now, his voice gently. I was the worst kind of alpha, and I have done nothing yet to prove I am anything else. But I am asking, not commanding. He took a step toward her, then another, moving slowly so as not to frighten her. When he was close enough, he did something that shocked every wolf present into stunned silence. Kieran Frost, the Alpha King, who had once crushed 12 packs beneath his rule, dropped to his knees before an Omega. He bowed his head, a gesture of submission that should have been impossible for an Alpha of his power. This was not how the hierarchy worked. This was not the natural order. But Kieran had spent centuries learning what following those instincts had cost him. Will you let me protect you? He asked quietly, his voice for her alone despite the audience of dozens. Will you give me the chance to show you that I can be worthy of the gift you have given me? I do not ask you to accept the bond. I do not ask you to trust me. I only ask that you let me stand between you and anyone who would hurt you. Era stared at him, feeling the bond pulling at her, urging her to say yes to accept the mate that destiny had chosen for her. But she had spent 3 years learning to survive by trusting carefully and giving nothing away for free. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite her exhaustion and fear. I will give you a chance, she said slowly, choosing each word with care. But I need you to understand something. I do not want the Frozen King. I do not want the tyrant or the legend. If you become that creature again, bond or not, I will walk away. The clearing was silent. Every wolf watching to see how the awakened alpha would respond to an omega setting terms to a creature so far below him in the hierarchy daring to make demands. Kieran felt the bond screaming at him to assert dominance, to remind her that alphas led and omegas followed. Centuries of ingrained instincts roared in his ears, demanding that he put her in her place. But he had spent all those frozen years learning what following those instincts had cost him. He had listened to Ara for 3 years, had heard the pain in her voice when she described life under alphas, who believed dominance was the same as leadership. He would not be another alpha who failed her. Then I will spend every day proving I am no longer him, Kieran said, and there was a vow in his voice that resonated with the power of the bond itself. I will earn your trust and your respect. And if I fail, if I become what I was, then you have my permission to leave and my vow that I will not follow. You deserve a choice, Ara. You deserve everything I failed to give my first mate. Before anyone could react to this unprecedented exchange, Grayson made his move. Perhaps it was wounded pride. Perhaps it was the realization that if he could not control Ara, then no one else would be allowed to either. Perhaps it was simply the cruelty that had made him a terrible alpha in the first place. Whatever his motivation, Grayson shifted mid-leap, aiming for Ara's throat with the clear intention of killing what he could not possess. But he had forgotten, or perhaps had never truly understood, what a true alpha king was capable of. Kieran moved faster than should have been possible for someone who had been frozen for centuries. His body remembered combat, remembered violence, remembered exactly how to intercept an attack and turn it into a demonstration of dominance. He caught Grayson midair, one hand closing around the wolf's throat, and slammed him into the frozen ground with enough force to crack stone. The impact drove the air from Grayson's lungs and left him gasping, unable to shift back to human form, unable to do anything but struggle weakly in Kieran's iron grip. Kieran's hand tightened, not enough to crush, but enough to make breathing difficult. When he spoke, his voice dropped to a lethal purr that carried clearly despite its softness. You just tried to kill my mate in front of me. Give me one reason I should not tear you apart for that insult. Grayson choked and struggled, his claws scrabbling uselessly against Kieran's wrist. Around the clearing, the Shadow Moon wolves watched their alpha being dominated, and Kieran could feel their pack bonds wavering. An alpha who could be so easily overpowered lost the respect of his wolves. Their faith in Grayson's strength was crumbling with every second he remained pinned. Kieran could sense their willingness to transfer loyalty to someone stronger. It would be easy to take the pack, to kill Grayson and claim his wolves as his own. It was what the old Kieran would have done without hesitation, would have seen as his right as the superior alpha. But the old Kieran had not spent 3 years listening to Ara describe the pain of living under a cruel alpha. He looked at the Shadow Moon wolves and saw their fear, saw the Omegas cowering at the back of the group, 4 of them huddled together, who had probably suffered as much as Ara under Grayson's rule. Killing their alpha might satisfy his rage, but it would not help them build something better. It would only prove that he was still what he had been, still the tyrant who solved problems through violence. Kieran released Grayson, letting the alpha collapse, gasping to the ground. The Shadow Moon leader coughed and wheezed, struggling to draw breath, his eyes wide with shock and humiliation. You are pathetic, Kieran said, his voice cutting. A true alpha protects those weaker than himself. He does not torment them for entertainment or exploit them for profit. Your pack deserves better than you. He raised his voice so that every wolf could hear him clearly. Any Shadow Moon wolf who wants sanctuary is welcome to join me. I am building something new here. A pack based on the principles I learned while Frozen Strength used to protect, not oppress. Omegas valued and respected, not enslaved. And everyone, Alpha, Beta, or Omega, will have a voice in how we are governed. The response was immediate and more profound than Kieran had anticipated. More than half of Grayson's wolves stepped forward, moving away from their alpha to stand with Kieran. It was not just the Omegas, though. All 4 of them moved quickly, clearly desperate to escape. 3 young alphas also crossed the clearing, their faces set with determination. A beta followed. 8 wolves total, abandoning their pack to follow someone they had just met, someone who existed only in legend and nightmare. But they had seen him kneel before an Omega. They had heard him speak of respect and choice. And perhaps most importantly, they had witnessed him spare an alpha who deserved death, choosing mercy over violence. It was a glimpse of something different, something better than what they had known. And they were willing to risk everything for it. Grayson snarled and tried to command them back, his alpha voice cracking with desperation as he attempted to enforce the pack bonds. But his authority was broken. A challenged alpha who had been dominated in front of his pack had no power left. He could only watch as his wolves left him, as his pack was torn apart by his own failures. The Shadow Moon Alpha climbed to his feet, blood dripping from his mouth where he had bitten his tongue during the impact. His eyes promised violence and revenge as he looked at Kieran. "This is not over," he hissed. "You have made an enemy today, Frozen King, and when I return, I will not be alone." Kieran met his gaze without flinching. "If you come for her, for any of them, I will end you. That is not a threat. It is a promise." Grayson shifted back to wolf form and fled into the forest, followed by the 6 wolves who had remained loyal to him. Their howls of rage and humiliation echoed through the trees, fading slowly into the distance. The rogue cultists were a different problem. Their leader still watched Kieran with fanatical hope, clearly convinced that this was all political maneuvering and that eventually the Frozen King would return to his true nature. Kieran addressed them directly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "I understand why you came here," he said. "You believe the world has grown soft, that giving Omega's rights and protections is somehow unnatural. But you are wrong. Those ways nearly destroyed our kind. They bred cruelty and suffering and turned us into creatures that humans were right to fear." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I will not return to them. If you cannot accept that, then leave now and do not come back. Find another cause, another leader. But know that if you try to force me back into the role of tyrant, I will oppose you with everything I am." Some of the cultists left immediately, unable to reconcile their beliefs with this new reality. They slipped away into the forest, their dreams of restoration shattered. But others stayed. Kieran counted 11 of them, including their scarred leader. And as he studied their faces, he saw something that gave him pause. These were not all true believers in cruelty and domination. Some of them were simply lost. They were wolves who had been rejected by their packs, who had found no place in the modern hierarchy, who had latched onto the cult because they needed something to believe in, something to give their lives meaning. They did not want a tyrant. They wanted a leader worth following. Vargas Ironhide, the cult leader, stepped forward. His expression was conflicted, torn between the faith he had held for decades and the reality standing before him. "We have waited," he said quietly. "We kept the faith when others forgot. We believed you would return and restore what was lost. If you will not be that king, what are we supposed to believe in now?" It was a genuine question asked with the vulnerability of someone whose entire worldview had just been shattered. Kieran understood that feeling better than most. "Believe in becoming better," he said. "Believe that strength can be used to protect instead of dominate. Believe that we can build something new that honors what was good about the old ways while discarding what was cruel. If you want to follow me, you are welcome. But you follow the alpha I am becoming, not what I was." Vargas stared at him for a long moment, then slowly, deliberately, he knelt. It was not the forced submission of dominated wolves, but a conscious choice to pledge loyalty. "We will follow," he said, "and we will watch. If you can truly build something better, we will believe. If you cannot, we will know we were right." It was not blind faith or absolute loyalty. It was conditional trust, earned rather than demanded. Kieran would take it. As the clearing slowly emptied of those who would not or could not follow this new path, Kieran found himself with Ara and 19 new followers. 8 from Shadow Moon, 11 from the cult. 20 wolves total, including himself. It was a pack, a small one, barely enough to defend territory or sustain itself. But it was a beginning. He turned to look at the wolves who had chosen to stay. They watched him with a mixture of hope and wariness, waiting to see what kind of leader he would be. Kieran's eyes found the 4 Omegas who had fled from Shadow Moon. They were huddled together, still afraid, despite having chosen to leave their old pack. The youngest looked barely 19, her eyes haunted by experiences no one so young should have endured. "What are your names?" he asked gently, making his voice as non-threatening as possible. The youngest spoke first, her voice trembling. "Saren Alpha." "Rowena," said another, older, perhaps 24. Leora offered a third, who looked to be in her early 30s. Astrid finished the last, around 28, with scars on her arms that spoke of abuse. "No," Kieran said firmly, "not Alpha. My name is Kieran, and you do not owe me submission or deference. You owe me nothing. I am the one who owes you. I owe you safety and respect and the promise that no one will treat you as property ever again." He looked at the three young alphas who had defected. And your names? Dorian, said one tall and lean, perhaps 23. Caspian, offered another, broad-shouldered and serious, around 26. Aldrich finished the third, who carried himself with quiet confidence, despite his youth of 25. And I'm Finian, added the beta who had crossed over 22 and wiry. Kieran nodded to each of them. Thank you for your trust. I know you do not know me, do not know if I can keep the promises I made. But I swear to you I will try every day to be worthy of the choice you made today. He turned finally to Ara, still slumped against the tree, watching everything with exhausted eyes. Their bond hummed between them, a constant awareness of her presence that he knew he would never grow accustomed to. Centuries of isolation, and now he was tethered to someone else in the most fundamental way possible. She looked terrified and exhausted and heartbreakingly vulnerable. Kieran approached slowly, making himself as non-threatening as possible despite his size. When he was close enough, he knelt again, bringing himself down to her eye level. You used a lot of power breaking the curse, he said quietly. You need rest and food and warmth. Will you let me help you? Era studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for any sign of deception or hidden cruelty. The bond let her feel his genuine concern, his desperate need to protect her, his fear that he would fail her as he had failed Elena. Finally, she nodded. Kieran stood and carefully, gently lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, evidence of 3 years of near starvation. The realization made anger pulse through him again, but he pushed it down. Anger could wait. Ara's needs came first. He looked at his new pack, these 19 souls who had chosen to follow someone they barely knew, based on nothing but hope and desperation. We need shelter, he said. It will be dark soon, and a storm is coming. Ara stirred in his arms. 2 hours, she murmured, her voice weak. Maybe less. The clouds. I've been watching them. Every wolf in the clearing looked up at the sky, seeing the dark formation that Ara had noticed hours ago. The storm that was about to make this mountain pass nearly impassable. You can predict weather, Kieran asked, impressed despite the circumstances. I've been teaching myself, Ara said. 3 years of observation. Wind patterns, cloud formations, animal behavior. No one ever listened, but I kept learning anyway. Kieran felt something warm bloom in his chest. She had been surviving in her own way, building skills that others dismissed because they could not see past her supposed defect. She was remarkable, and he had centuries of mistakes to atone for if he wanted to be worthy of her. Then we listen now, he said firmly, addressing the whole group. Ara says a storm is coming in 2 hours. We need to find shelter immediately. Does anyone know this area well enough to suggest options? Vargas stepped forward. There are caves 3 miles northeast, large enough for 20 wolves defensible. My people have used them before. Lead the way, Kieran commanded. Then looking at the exhausted Omega in his arms, he added softly, hold on. I will keep you safe. That is a promise I intend to keep. As they began moving through the forest, racing against the storm, and the failing light, Kieran allowed himself one moment to look back at the clearing where he had spent so long frozen. The ice was completely gone, melted away as though it had never existed. Only a circle of disturbed earth remained, marking the place where his punishment had ended and his redemption had begun. He did not know if he could truly become the alpha these wolves needed. He did not know if centuries of reflection had been enough to kill the tyrant he had been. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he would die before he let anyone hurt Ara again. The journey to the caves was brutal. The storm Ara had predicted arrived with a vengeance, transforming the forest into a whiteout nightmare of wind and snow. Visibility dropped to mere feet, and the temperature plummeted so rapidly that even the wolves with their natural resistance to cold began to struggle. Kieran carried Ara the entire way, his body shielding her from the worst of the wind. She had fallen into an exhausted half-sleep, her power completely drained from shattering the curse that had held him since 1724. Through their connection, he could feel her flickering consciousness, could sense how close she was to simply shutting down from exhaustion and malnutrition. It terrified him. Centuries of forced stillness, and now he was responsible for this fragile Omega who had shown him kindness when he deserved none. The weight of that responsibility was crushing and exhilarating in equal measure. Vargas led them through the storm with the confidence of someone who knew these mountains intimately. Despite his fanatical devotion to beliefs Kieran had rejected, he clearly possessed genuine wilderness skills. He navigated by landmarks that were barely visible through the blizzard, a distinctive rock formation here, a lightning-struck pine there, until finally they arrived at a cliff face where several cave openings yawned like dark mouths. The largest is defensible, Vargas called over the wind, pointing to the central opening. Deep enough for all of us, with a narrow entrance that can be guarded easily. Kieran nodded and led the way inside, still cradling Era against his chest. The cave was indeed large, the ceiling high enough that he could stand at full height even in human form. The floor was relatively flat, covered in a layer of dirt and scattered pine needles that must have blown in over the years. More importantly, it was dry and sheltered from the wind. The temperature inside was still cold, but nothing compared to the lethal chill outside. "We need fire," Kieran said, laying Ara down gently on a relatively clean patch of ground near the back wall. "And food. Does anyone have supplies?" The responses were disheartening. Most of the wolves had come straight from the battle in the clearing with no preparation for an extended stay in the wilderness. A few had emergency rations, dried meat, and hard bread, but nothing that would sustain 20 wolves for more than a day or two. Finian the beta, who had defected from Shadowmoon, stepped forward. "I can hunt even in this storm. Deer use the valleys on the eastern slope for shelter. If I take one or two others, we could bring back enough meat for tonight at least." "Take Caspian and Aldrich," Kieran said, gesturing to two of the young alphas. "Be careful. This storm is going to get worse before it gets better." As the hunting party prepared to leave, Dorian approached with an armful of dry wood he had found stacked near the cave entrance. "Someone used this place recently," he observed. "There's a fire ring already set up, and this wood has been stored deliberately." "My people camp here periodically," Vargas confirmed. "We keep it stocked with basic supplies. There should be some furs deeper in the cave as well, and water skins." Within 20 minutes, they had a fire blazing in the stone ring, its warmth slowly spreading through the cave. The four Omegas huddled close to it, their faces gaunt and exhausted. Kieran studied them carefully, noting the signs of long-term malnutrition and abuse that mirrored what he saw in Aurora. Shadow Moonpack had failed these wolves in every possible way, and Kieran had created the culture that made such failures possible. The hierarchy he had enforced with brutal efficiency, it had all led to this. To Omegas being treated as disposable as less than nothing. The weight of that realization settled on him like a physical burden. Rowena the Omega, who appeared to be in her mid-20s, was the first to speak. Her voice was hesitant, as though she was not accustomed to anyone actually listening to what she had to say. "Kieran, why did you spare Grayson? He tried to kill your mate. Everyone knows what you were capable of." Every eye in the cave turned to Kieran, waiting for his answer. This was a test, he realized. Not a hostile one, but these wolves needed to understand what kind of leader he would be. "Centuries ago, I would have killed him without hesitation," Kieran said. "I would have seen it as my right, as justice, as the natural consequence of his actions." He paused, staring into the fire, seeing reflections of the past in the flames. "But I spent a very long time thinking about the cost of that philosophy. Every time I killed to prove my dominance, every time I used violence to solve a problem, I created new enemies and new cycles of revenge. I created a culture where might made right, where the strong could abuse the weak without consequence." He looked at Rowena, then at each of the other Omegas in turn. "Grayson deserved death for what he did to you, to Era, to everyone he abused. But killing him would not have helped you. It would only have proven that I am still what I was, still someone who believes violence is the answer to everything." "So what is the answer?" asked Leora the Omega in her 30s with haunted eyes. "If not violence, how do you stop alphas like Grayson?" "Accountability," Kieran said. "Community standards, making it clear that abuse will not be tolerated and that there are consequences beyond death." Grayson lost his pack today. He lost his status, his authority, his reputation. Half his wolves chose to follow a complete stranger rather than stay with him. That is a more fitting punishment than a quick death would have been. Seren, the youngest Omega, spoke up in a small voice. "But he will come back. He said so. He will want revenge." "Probably," Kieran acknowledged, "and when he does, we will be ready. But we will face him as a pack with strategy and preparation, not just with brute force." The hunting party returned sooner than expected, dragging two good-sized deer through the snow. Finian was grinning despite the cold, clearly proud of the quick success. "The storm drove them down from the high peaks," he explained. "They were sheltering in a ravine not a mile from here. Easy hunting." Vargas and several others made quick work of field dressing the deer, their movements efficient and practiced. Within the hour, meat was roasting over the fire, filling the cave with a smell that made everyone's mouths water. Kieran took a portion of the first cooked meat and brought it to Ara, who had woken but still looked dangerously weak. She was propped against the cave wall, watching the activity around her with confusion and wariness. "You need to eat," he said gently, offering her the meat. "You used an enormous amount of power today. Your body needs fuel to recover." Ara took the food with trembling hands, and Kieran noticed how carefully she rationed each bite, making it last, as though she expected it to be taken away at any moment. It was the behavior of someone who had lived with food scarcity for too long. Through their connection, he felt her uncertainty, her fear that this was temporary, that she would wake up to find herself back in her shack being tormented by Shadow Moon wolves. "This is real," Kieran said quietly, responding to emotions she had not spoken aloud. "You are safe here. No one will hurt you. No one will take your food or mock you or treat you as a burden." Era looked at him with eyes that had seen too much cruelty to trust easily. "You say that now. But what happens when the bond demands things from me that I cannot give? What happens when your alpha instincts override these good intentions?" It was a fair question, a brutal question, and one that Kieran knew he had to answer honestly. "I cannot promise I will never struggle," he admitted. Centuries of thinking does not erase a lifetime of being raised to believe alphas were superior. That dominance was the same as leadership. The instincts are still there. I can feel them even now screaming at me to assert control, to make demands, to treat the bond as ownership rather than partnership. He met her eyes steadily. "But I can promise that I will fight those instincts every single day. And I can promise that when I fail, because I will fail, or I am not healed or fixed or perfect, you will call me on it and I will listen. You will be my conscience, as you were for 3 years when I was frozen." Ara studied him for a long moment, chewing slowly. Finally, she swallowed and said, "I need you to understand something. I have spent 3 years being told I am invisible, being treated as less than nothing. I have been starved and mocked and threatened with death for the crime of existing without a cent." Her voice grew stronger, more certain. "I will not trade one form of imprisonment for another. I will not be owned even by a mate. If you cannot give me autonomy, if you cannot treat me as an equal partner rather than a possession, then this bond means nothing to me. I would rather die alone in these mountains than live as someone's property." The cave had gone silent. Every wolf was listening now, shocked by an Omega speaking so boldly to an Alpha, especially an Alpha King. This was not how pack dynamics were supposed to work. This violated every rule of the hierarchy. Kieran felt the bond reacting to her words, felt his alpha instincts rising up in protest. She was his mate. The bond gave him certain rights, certain expectations of submission and deference. Every fiber of his being wanted to remind her of her place in the natural order. But he had spent all those frozen years learning what following those instincts had cost him. He had rejected Elena for political advantage, had treated his true mate as disposable because she did not fit into his plans. And he had paid for that choice with centuries of frozen awareness, forced to confront the magnitude of his mistake over and over again. He would not repeat that mistake with Ara. "Then those are the terms," Kieran said, and his voice carried across the cave so that everyone could witness this moment. "Autonomy, equality, partnership. You are not my possession, Ara. You never will be." He paused, then made a decision that he knew would shock everyone present. Kieran rose to his feet and knelt before her once more, this massive Alpha King, making himself low before an Omega who had no scent, no status, no power beyond what she had used to free him. "I, Kieran Frost, swear before these witnesses that I will never use the bond to command, you will never treat you as property, and will never demand submission from you. I swear that I will earn your trust, rather than take it, will respect your autonomy, rather than override it, and will value your voice as equal to my own in all decisions." The words hung in the air like a binding spell. Around the cave, wolves stared in disbelief. This was unprecedented. This violated every principle of pack hierarchy that had governed werewolf society for millennia. But Kieran was not finished. "More than that," he continued, "I swear that you have the right to leave. If I fail you, if I become what I was, if you decide this bond is not what you want, you can walk away. And I will not follow. I will not hunt you down or force you back. Your freedom is more important than my desires." Tears were streaming down Era's face now, but they were different from the tears that had broken his curse. These were tears of disbelief, of hope, of something that might become trust if he did not destroy it. "You would really let me go," she whispered. "I would," Kieran said, and meant it with every fiber of his being, "because forcing you to stay would make me exactly what I swore I would never become again. And I would rather lose you than become that creature." Ara set down her food and reached out with a trembling hand, placing it on Kieran's bowed head. Through their connection, he felt her emotions shock gratitude and the first fragile threads of something that might become affection given time and proof. "Then I will stay," she said quietly, "not because the bond demands it, but because I choose to. I will stay, and I will give you the chance you are asking for. But Kieran, if you ever make me regret this choice, I will leave, and I will never look back. Fair, Kieran said, looking up at her. More than fair. Vargas was the first to speak into the silence that followed. His voice carried a note of confusion that bordered on distress. I do not understand, he said slowly. You are the Alpha King. You have the power to take whatever you want to command absolute obedience. Why would you give that power away? Why would you kneel before an Omega? Kieran stood turning to face the scarred cult leader and the other wolves who watched with similar confusion. Because power taken by force is always weaker than power given freely, he said. An Omega forced to submit will obey out of fear, but they will never truly be loyal. They will never give you their best effort, their honest counsel, their genuine partnership. They will only give you the minimum required to avoid punishment. He gestured to Ara. She has no reason to trust me, no reason to believe I will be better than the Alphas who abused her. But if I can earn her trust, if I can prove through actions rather than commands that I value her as an equal, then I will gain something far more powerful than forced submission. I will gain a true partner. That is not how things have always worked, Vargas protested, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. I created monsters through that philosophy, Kieran said bluntly. I gave Alphas permission to abuse anyone weaker told us that dominance was the same as leadership, that taking what we wanted was our right. And look where it led. Look at these Omegas who were starved and beaten by their own pack. Look at Ara who was going to be banished to die in winter for the crime of being different. He let that sink in before continuing. If that is what you want me to restore, then you followed the wrong Alpha. But if you are willing to consider that strength can be used to protect rather than dominate, that leadership means serving your pack rather than ruling over them, then I will show you something better than what we lost. The cave was silent for a long moment. The wolves processed this as Kieran could see the conflict on their faces, the struggle between what they had been taught to believe and what they were witnessing. Astrid, one of the Omegas with scars on her arms, spoke up hesitantly. At Shadow Moon, Alpha Grayson always said that Omega nature was to submit, that we were happiest when we knew our place. He said it was for our own good when he punished us for stepping out of line. He lied, Kieran said flatly. He used the language of nature and instinct to justify cruelty. Yes, Omegas have a biological tendency toward nurturing and cooperation. But that does not mean you exist to be dominated or abused. It means you have gifts that should be valued and respected, not exploited. He looked at each of the Omegas in turn. Tell me, in all your time at Shadow Moon, did any Alpha ever ask your opinion on pack decisions? Did anyone value your insights or treat your voice as worth hearing? 4 heads shook in unison. That ends now, Kieran said. In this pack, everyone has a voice. Omega, Beta, Alpha, I do not care. If you have wisdom to share concerns, to raise ideas, to contribute, you will be heard. That is a promise. Dorian, one of the young Alphas, raised a hand hesitantly. What if we disagree with you? What if we think you are making a mistake? Then you tell me, Kieran said simply. You challenge my decision, you present your reasoning, and we discuss it like rational beings. I will not punish you for disagreeing with me. In fact, I want you to disagree when you think I am wrong. That is how we avoid the mistakes that isolated Alphas make. But you are still Alpha, Dorian pressed. Someone has to have final authority. Someone has to make the hard decisions when consensus cannot be reached. True, Kieran acknowledged, and I will make those decisions when necessary, but I will make them with the benefit of your input, your expertise, your perspectives. And if I make a decision you think is genuinely wrong, you have the right to call me on it and demand I explain my reasoning. Caspian, the broad-shouldered Alpha, frowned. At Shadow Moon, questioning the Alpha was grounds for punishment, sometimes severe punishment. You are saying we can challenge you without consequences. I am saying you can challenge my decisions without being punished for it, Kieran clarified. If you challenge me with disrespect, if you undermine pack cohesion, if you put others at risk through your actions, those things have consequences. But honest disagreement, constructive criticism, different perspectives, those are valuable, not punishable. He could see them struggling to process this, struggling to believe that an Alpha would voluntarily limit his own authority. The truth was Kieran was struggling too. Every instinct screamed at him that he was making himself weak, that he was inviting chaos, that Alphas led and others followed, and that was the natural order. But all those frozen years had taught him that the natural order was not always the right order. Seren spoke up again, her young voice carrying across the cave. What happens if someone takes advantage? What if wolves join us just to exploit this freedom, to abuse the fact that you will listen to them? It was a smart question, showing more strategic thinking than anyone would expect from a 19-year-old Omega who had been abused for years. Then we deal with them as a pack, Kieran said. We establish rules together, we hold each other accountable, and we make it clear that freedom comes with responsibility. This is not anarchy. This is not a pack without structure or expectations. This is a pack where the structure serves everyone rather than just the strongest. Outside, the storm was intensifying. Wind howled past the cave entrance, and snow was beginning to drift inside despite the sheltered location. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and Kieran could see some of the wolves beginning to shiver. We need to conserve warmth, he said, shifting into practical leadership mode. Everyone should pair up or form small groups for body heat, the Omegas closest to the fire alphas and betas on the outside. It was standard cold weather protocol for wolf packs, but the Omegas looked surprised that they were being prioritized. At Shadow Moon, they had always been given the worst positions, forced to the edges where the cold was harshest. As the wolves began arranging themselves for sleep, Kieran returned to Era. She had finished her meat and was looking more alert, though still exhausted. You need rest, he said quietly. Real rest, not the half-sleep you have been surviving on for 3 years. Era looked at the arrangements being made around the cave, at the way wolves were pairing up for warmth. Her expression was uncertain, almost fearful. Where do I sleep? She asked. Kieran felt the bond pulling at him, urging him to claim the right to sleep beside her, to wrap himself around her and keep her warm through the night. The alpha in him wanted to assert that privilege, to make it clear to every other wolf that she was his, but he had just sworn to respect her autonomy. Wherever you feel safest, he said instead. If you want to sleep near the other Omegas, that is your choice. If you want me nearby for additional warmth and protection, I will keep my distance until you say otherwise. This is your decision, Ara. Always. She stared at him for a long moment, clearly testing whether he meant what he said. Finally, she spoke. I want you close enough to protect me if something happens, but not touching. Not yet. I need time to adjust to the bond, to feeling someone else's emotions constantly. Then I will sleep 3 feet away, Kieran said. Close enough to reach you in seconds, if needed, far enough to give you space. Does that work? Era nodded, and Kieran could feel her relief through their connection. She had expected him to push to demand more intimacy than she was ready to give. The fact that he had respected her boundaries without argument was slowly building trust. As the wolves settled in for the night, Kieran arranged sleeping furs for both himself and Ara. He placed them exactly 3 feet apart, measuring the distance carefully to show he meant what he said. Ara curled up in her furs, and within minutes she was asleep, her exhaustion finally claiming her. Kieran stayed awake, keeping watch even though others had volunteered for the duty. Through their bond, he could feel her sleeping mind, could sense the nightmares that plagued her, memories of abuse and starvation and the constant fear of being invisible. Each nightmare made him want to wake her, to comfort her, to promise that those days were over. But he restrained himself. She needed sleep more than she needed comfort from him. Vargas approached quietly, settling down near Kieran, but maintaining a respectful distance. I have followed the idea of you for 30 years, the scarred man said quietly. I joined the cult when I was barely more than a pup, convinced that the Frozen King would return and restore the natural order. I have built my entire life around that belief. He paused, staring into the dying fire. Watching you today, you are nothing like what I expected. Nothing like what I wanted you to be. And I find myself wondering if we were worshipping a lie all along. You were worshipping what I was, Kieran said, a tyrant who used power to crush others. That version of me did exist, Vargas. I was every bit as terrible as the legends say. Then what changed, Vargas asked. I spent centuries being forced to watch the consequences of my actions play out in my memory, Kieran said. I could not distract myself, could not rationalize, could not avoid confronting what I had done. And slowly, agonizingly slowly, I began to understand that strength without compassion is just cruelty with a different name. He looked at the sleeping Omega 3 feet away. And then she came. This Omega who had every reason to be bitter and cruel, who had been treated as garbage by her own pack. And she showed me kindness anyway. She talked to me as though I deserved to be treated like a person. She made me want to be better than I was. Vargas was silent for a long time. Finally, he said, I will stay. I will watch, and perhaps I will learn what real strength looks like. It was not a declaration of absolute loyalty, but it was honest. And Kieran would take honest uncertainty over false devotion any day. As the night deepened and the storm raged outside, Kieran kept his vigil. 20 wolves slept in the cave, trusting him to protect them, to lead them to be better than the alpha he had been. The weight of that trust was crushing. But for the first time since 1724, Kieran felt something that might become hope. He had been given a second chance, a mate who deserved better than he had been. Wolves who were willing to follow despite having every reason to fear him. He would not waste this opportunity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Grayson's promised revenge. The cult's conditional loyalty. Ara's fragile trust that could shatter with a single mistake. But tomorrow could wait. Tonight he would stand watch over wolves who had risked everything to believe in him. He would protect them from the storm outside and the demons of his past. He would prove through action, not words, that redemption was possible. Kieran allowed himself one moment of reflection as he watched Ara sleep. Yesterday he had been frozen alone, convinced he deserved nothing but punishment. Today he had a mate who challenged him to be better wolves who had chosen to follow based on hope rather than fear, and a chance to prove that even the worst mistakes could be learned from. Through the bond he felt Ara's nightmares fade as exhaustion finally pulled her into deeper sleep. The other Omegas huddled close to the fire, their breathing gradually evening out. Even Vargas the Zealot, who had worshipped what Kieran had been, now rested under the protection of what he was becoming. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and somewhere deep in his chest, where the ice had held him frozen for so long, Kieran felt warmth spreading. He had centuries of mistakes to atone for. He had instincts to fight and trust to earn, and a pact to protect. But as he watched over these wolves who had given him a chance he had not earned, Kieran allowed himself to believe that perhaps with time and effort and Ara's guidance, he could become worthy of the gift he had been given. The storm would pass, morning would come, and he would face whatever challenges awaited with wolves at his back and a mate who refused to let him become the monster again. That was enough. For now, that was more than enough. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the world outside the cave transformed into a crystalline wonderland of fresh snow and ice-covered branches that caught the first rays of morning light. Kieran had kept watch through the entire night, his body still adjusting to the sensation of movement. After centuries of stillness, his mind refusing to rest while those under his protection slept. As pale sunlight began filtering into the cave, the wolves stirred one by one. The Omegas were the first to wake old habits from Shadow Moon, making them rise early despite their exhaustion. They looked surprised to find Kieran still alert, even more surprised when he greeted them by name and asked if they had slept well. Ara woke slowly, her eyes opening to find Kieran exactly where he had been when she fell asleep 3 feet away, watching over her without crowding her space. Through their bond, she felt his relief at seeing her rested, felt the careful restraint he was exercising to give her the autonomy he had promised. "The storm passed," he said quietly. "We are safe for now." "For now," Ara echoed, sitting up slowly. Her body still ached from the power she had expended breaking the curse, but food and sleep had helped. She studied Kieran's face, seeing the exhaustion he was trying to hide. "You did not sleep at all." "I will rest later," Kieran said. "First, we need to establish basic security and figure out how to sustain 20 wolves through winter." It was a practical concern that could not be ignored. The deer from last night would feed them for perhaps 2 more days. After that, they would need a consistent source of food shelter that could withstand the mountain winter and a plan for defending themselves against the threats that would inevitably come. As the pack gathered around the rekindled fire, Kieran did something that shocked them once again. Instead of issuing commands, he asked for input. "We have challenges ahead," he said, addressing the group. "Food, shelter, defense. I need to know what skills each of you possess. What can you contribute?" The wolves exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unused to being asked rather than told. Finian spoke first. "I am a skilled hunter and tracker. I know these mountains well enough to find game even in winter." "I can build," Dorian offered hesitantly. "My father was a carpenter before he was turned. He taught me woodworking, shelter construction." "I know herbs," Rowena said quietly. "Healing plants, which ones are safe to eat, how to preserve food." One by one, the wolves revealed skills that had been ignored or suppressed in their previous packs. Caspian had experience with defense strategies. Aldrich understood weather patterns almost as well as Ara. Leora could sew and repair clothing. Astrid knew how to tan hides and preserve meat. Even the cult members had valuable knowledge. Vargas knew the location of caves, water sources, and game trails throughout the region. His followers had survival skills honed by years of living on the fringes of pack society. Kieran listened to each contribution, asking questions, valuing their expertise. And slowly a plan began to form. Finian, take Caspian and Aldrich. Scout the area for a more permanent shelter location. We need something defensible with access to water and game. Dorian, work with Vargas. Assess what we can build with the materials available. We will need better shelter before the deep winter sets in. Rowena, Leora, Astrid, inventory our resources. Figure out what we have and what we desperately need. He turned to Era last. And you will teach me about the weather patterns you have been studying. If we are to survive winter, we need to be able to predict storms as accurately as you did yesterday. Ara blinked in surprise. You want to learn from me? You kept yourself alive for 3 years using skills you taught yourself, Kieran said. That makes you far more qualified to teach survival than I am. I was frozen while the world changed. I need to learn how to live in it again. It was a statement of humility that resonated through the cave. An Alpha King admitting he needed to learn, asking an Omega to teach him. The pack began to move with purpose assignments, giving them direction and hope. As wolves filed out to begin their tasks, Serene approached Kieran hesitantly. What about me? The young Omega asked. I do not have skills like the others. At Shadow Moon, they never let me learn anything useful. Kieran knelt down to her level, meeting her eyes. Then you will learn now. Choose what interests you. Hunting, building, healing, defense, whatever calls to you. You are 19, Serene. Your life is just beginning. Do not let what they told you define what you become. Tears welled in Serene's eyes, but she nodded, a small smile breaking through. I would like to learn healing from Rowena. Then that is what you will do, Kieran said. As the day progressed, the pack worked together in ways they never had before. Hierarchies dissolved into collaboration. Alphas listened to Omega suggestions. Betas organized resources. Everyone contributed according to their abilities rather than their designation. Kieran moved among them, learning, helping, leading, not through dominance, but through example. He carried heavy loads alongside the betas. Listened to Rowena's advice about edible plants, helped Dorian measure timber for construction. And through it all, he kept Ara close, not possessively, but protectively, always aware of her presence through their bond, always checking that she was not pushing herself too hard as she recovered. By midday, Finian's scouting party returned with news. They had found a larger cave system 2 miles south with multiple chambers, a natural spring inside, and defensive positioning that would be difficult for enemies to assault. It would require work to make it fully habitable, but it could shelter far more than 20 wolves if their pack grew. It is perfect, Kieran said after hearing the full report. We move tomorrow. Tonight we rest and prepare. As evening fell and the pack gathered for their second shared meal, the atmosphere was different from the previous night. There was laughter now, tentative but real. Wolves who had been strangers 24 hours ago were beginning to bond, finding common ground in their shared escape from bad situations and their hope for something better. Vargas approached Kieran as the Alpha stood at the cave entrance looking out at the moonlit snow. I have been thinking about what you said, the scarred man began. About strength and compassion, about building something new. And, Kieran prompted, I am not certain I believe it will work, Vargas admitted. Centuries of tradition do not disappear overnight. There will be packs that see your methods as weakness, that will try to destroy what you are building. I know, Kieran said. But, Vargas continued, I have also been watching these wolves today. I saw Saren smile for the first time since I have known her. I saw Omega speak up without fear. I saw Alphas listen to those they once would have dismissed. And I think perhaps there is strength in that. A different kind of strength than what I was taught to value. Kieran turned to face him fully. I cannot promise this will be easy. I cannot promise we will not face opposition or that I will not make mistakes. But I can promise that I will try every day to be better than what I was. Vargas nodded slowly. Then I will try as well, to learn this new way, to see if strength and compassion can coexist. It was a beginning, a small one but genuine. Inside the cave, Kieran found Ara sitting with the other Omegas, teaching them about cloud formations and weather prediction. She looked up as he approached, and through their bond, he felt her contentment, her cautious optimism. Walk with me, he asked quietly. Ara nodded and rose, following him to the cave entrance, where they could see the stars emerging in the clear night sky. You did well today, Kieran said. Leading by teaching, by sharing your knowledge. These wolves respect you. They respect what you are trying to build, Ara corrected. I am just helping where I can. You are doing more than that, Kieran said. You are showing them what it means to value knowledge over strength, to respect expertise regardless of designation. You are teaching me how to lead differently. Ara was quiet for a moment, then said, I am still afraid of the bond of what happens if you change, of Grayson coming back. But today I saw something I have never seen before. Wolves working together because they wanted to, not because they were forced. Omega's being valued. You keeping your promises. She looked up at him, moonlight catching in her eyes. I'm still not ready to fully accept the bond. I still need time and space and proof that this is real. But I want you to know I see you trying, and that matters. Kieran felt something tighten in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the mate bond and everything to do with earning something freely given. Then I will keep trying, he said, for as long as it takes. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars, while behind them in the cave, their pack, small and strange and imperfect, began to build something new. Tomorrow they would move to their permanent home. Tomorrow they would face the challenges of establishing territory and defending it against those who would oppose their radical ideas. Tomorrow Grayson might return with reinforcements, or the cult might fracture, or any number of threats might emerge. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years for Ara, and the first time in 3 centuries for Kieran, they both had something they had not dared to hope for. They had a pack, they had purpose, they had each other, however tentatively. And as the moon rose higher over the mountains, casting silver light across the snow-covered world, Kieran made a silent vow to the moon goddess who had given him this second chance. He would protect these wolves. He would earn Ara's trust one day at a time. He would prove that even the worst mistakes could be learned from, that even monsters could choose to become something better. The frozen wolf had awakened, but the true transformation was only just beginning. Spring had come to the mountains, bringing with it new growth and new wolves seeking sanctuary. The pack had grown to 43 members, their reputation spreading as a place where strength meant protection and Omegas had voices. Grayson had returned once with mercenaries, but careful planning and strategy had defeated them without a single casualty on Kieran's side. The former Shadow Moon Alpha was now in exile, his name a warning to those who abused their power. The Council of Regional Packs had sent observers suspicious of Kieran's methods, but unable to deny their effectiveness. 3 other packs had begun implementing similar reforms, treating Omegas as equals, valuing all contributions. And Ara, standing beside Kieran as they addressed the assembled pack, wore a small smile that spoke of trust finally fully earned. The bond between them had grown from tentative acceptance into genuine partnership, built day by day through kept promises and shared leadership. We have proven something, Kieran told the gathered wolves, that strength and compassion are not opposites, that leading means serving, that every wolf, regardless of designation, has value worth recognizing. Ara stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly. And we will continue to prove it, to anyone who doubts, to anyone who needs sanctuary. We are not perfect, but we are trying, and that makes all the difference. As the pack howled their agreement, Kieran looked at his mate and saw reflected in her eyes the same truth he felt in his heart. He had been frozen for 300 years, but it had taken only 6 months of freedom to learn what real strength looked like, and he would spend the rest of his life proving he had learned that lesson well.